Hello and welcome to the Bravas Luxury Living Podcast. On the Luxury Living Podcast, we explore ideas and themes for the smart luxury home to make it easier and more convenient to live in. Every time we tackle different subjects, sometimes technical, sometimes design, sometimes architectural. And if you're finding this interesting, please share this podcast with other people, like or subscribe to it, and let other people know about the Luxury Living Podcast. I do the Luxury Living Podcast each time with a colleague of mine from Dallas. Hello, Keith. How are you?
I'm good, Nigel. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. So today we're going to explore one of those issues, Keith, that we touched on before, but is often a question that burns up a lot of time with our sales team around networking, because it's really at the heart of every one of the homes we work on, isn't it?
Yeah, it is the heart of every home that we work on. And it's something that has probably been portrayed to our clients as a commodity, and it's anything but. So I think it'll be a really interesting topic.
Great. Well, we have as a guest with us from Access Networks, Ben Jurow. Ben is one of our key partners in this area. Welcome to the podcast, Ben.
Thank you. Pleased to be with you.
So, Ben, we always like to let our listeners know a little bit about who we have on. So why don't you give us a bit of your background and how you got to be here?
Sure. So first of all, thank you for having me. I've been with Access Networks for coming on 5 years. I think I'm a couple of weeks away from my 5-year mark. Before that, I worked in the control automation space. So I was with Savant Systems for about 6 years. And prior to that, I worked for some of the top tier integrators in New York City area, primarily as a programmer.
That's great. So we're going to talk about networking and home networking. And this is one of those subjects that we talk to our clients a lot. And one of the things I know our sales team will go is you need an enterprise class network. So let's break this into two parts. From where you sit, the first part is, why is the networking so critical to getting a smart home working?
Yeah, I mean, it's, why do you need a solid foundation for your home? Everything that you're going to put on that, put into that home is going to live on the network, whether it's entertainment, audio, video, whether it's control and integration, your thermostats, your lights, whatever it is that you're going to put into that home from an integration perspective is going to require a solid, reliable network in order to function. And then, of course, these days with work from home, school from home, et cetera, obviously you need a robust network infrastructure for that as well.
So when we use a phrase like enterprise class network, what is that? What is the enterprise? I mean, we're not going to build them a commercial property, are we? But there's a meaning here.
Yeah, it's a really good question because it's a term that sometimes gets abused, gets thrown around a little casually. Enterprise can mean a lot of things. Sometimes as a marketing term, it's used to describe mean time between failure, meaning how long is it going to operate before we expect for it to go down. It can refer to a feature set. It can refer to build quality. It could refer to how much visibility a solution has, meaning if you do get into a troubleshooting scenario, what sort of data can I pull out of there to get you out of that troubleshooting scenario? When I talk about enterprise grade, I talk about, is this used in enterprise deployments? And so I think that that's probably a better way to describe it. The thing to keep in mind is that when you are looking at enterprise, the hardware being enterprise grade, that's only one part of it. But you also need to have enterprise system design, enterprise grade system design, people who really understand the nuance that's involved in that. You need an enterprise level of programming and configuration, and then of course an enterprise level of support on the back end in case services required.
So from a practical standpoint, how does this enterprise grade system differ from like what the internet service provider or ISP would just install in someone's house as part of their, internet being connected?
Yeah, it's a great question. The internet providers, what their job really is to sell you a service, right? But once you're in the home, there's not a lot that they can do other than maybe giving you a faster pipe to your home. Like most consumer devices, whether it's an iPhone or whether it's the network devices that are going to be provided by your internet provider, those are being designed around the typical home and the typical homeowner, right? So that would mean a home that's probably smaller than 2,000 square feet, that doesn't have more than a couple people living there and doesn't have the number of client devices that we expect to have in an integrated home, the ones that we typically are involved in. So, having an enterprise solution, or even just a more robust network solution in there that takes into account the more challenging construction materials that we tend to see in larger, more robust homes. We're going to be able to cover the square footage that's required and be able to walk around the entire home and not have issues where you're stuck to connecting to one end of the home, but you're now standing on the other side of the home. And then of course having that white glove service again if you do run into a support issue to help you get that resolved as quickly as possible.
So it sounds like there's not necessarily anything wrong with the ISP solution. It just doesn't match every home. But before we go into that in more detail, because I think we should specify why that's so important, you mentioned the faster pipe piece. And this is something we hear a lot from our clients, which is essentially, I'm having internet issues. I need to upgrade to more speed, or I'm paying for a lot of speed and I'm not necessarily seeing it. Explain why that's not the solution for all problems.
Yeah, I mean, a faster pipe, more speed, that's great. It's certainly a nice thing to have, particularly if, your geographic location, that's something that's offered to you. But what I'm actually finding these days is most of the end users probably have a bigger pipe than they even need. If you think about, I want to watch, high def 4K Netflix, and so does my kid, and so does the rest of my family all at the same time. That doesn't require a whole lot in terms of the connectivity from the internet provider. So that just happens to be the tool they have, right? So that's what they're going to offer you. What I find is much more important is sort of what we discussed before is maintaining that connectivity, maintaining uptime, reliability, and just basically the concept of not having to think about your network. The way I look at it is that if you're thinking about your network, there's a problem with your network.
So I'm the one who always restates the obvious because I'm the least technical person here. But to me, that conversation of a bigger pipe is like saying if your local water provider puts a bigger pipe into your house from the mains, but the pipes in your house aren't any bigger, you're not getting any faster water. I mean, it's confusing to people. They go, well, I've got a gigabit internet, but it still sucks in my lounge. These two things are not as simple as that, are they?
Yeah, I mean, you can have a Ferrari in your garage that's capable of going a couple hundred miles an hour, but if you have a dirt driveway or worse, you're not going to get very far. So that's why we talk about the last mile, the infrastructure in the home is what's most important.
Yeah, and I guess we had, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but one of the things we had run into with clients was always saying, I need to upgrade my speeds. And we basically say, if you had, say, 20 gigs coming into your house and it was reliable, and you had a really strong network in your home, you would probably never need for more speed for most things they were doing. But you could have a gig or, a couple hundred times that. But if the network in the home is weak, you're always going to see deficiencies.
Yeah, exactly. So usually what we're trying to do is treat the symptoms, right? So somebody's telling me I'm trying to make a Zoom call and it's glitching out. I'm trying to watch Netflix. I'm trying to play Fortnite, whatever it is, and I'm not getting the performance that I like. It's certainly possible that you have an internet provider issue, but more likely you probably just need a more robust network in your home. Now, the interesting part about that is that we would just be speculating, depending on what type of equipment that we have, where the problem actually is, right? So maybe you do have an internet issue, maybe you have a Wi-Fi or a network infrastructure issue in your home. But unless you have the type of equipment that is going to log that data in such a way that can be interpreted and resolved, you're really going to be feeling around in the dark. And that sort of gets back up to the question of enterprise grade, because enterprise grade is going to have more data points that it's logging. So we can go ahead and review that and then figure out where the problem is. Maybe you need a different access point, or your access points need to be located in different parts of the home. Maybe you do need a different internet provider. Many of our end users find themselves with multiple internet providers, and that's something that we could do as well, because the idea of having redundancy, if your copper provider goes out, you have your fiber backup or your cellular backup, or even we've done some Starlink backups as well, some satellite internet. So we can, isolate those problems out.
I want to go back a subject to a couple of minutes ago, because and by the way, I'm really interested in the Starlink thing. I think that's, I'd love to understand more about that. But you made a comment earlier about the nature of the materials in the house, and that in a luxury home, sometimes there are different materials. And I'd really, really like to understand more about that. Is it the walls are different? Give a sense of people looking around their home. What should they be looking for that might have an impact on their internet?
It's a really good question. A lot of people don't think that you need to be a physics expert to do networking. You could be computer science, and physics is a different branch of the sciences. But physics for wireless is just as important as anything else. I think that we sort of intuitively understand this when we're talking about hi-fi and audio, the way that sound waves are going to travel and the materials of the home. But when we're talking about the RF in Wi-Fi, it's just as important. So typically when we're talking about, rules of thumb and, how many square feet that an access point is going to cover with Wi-Fi, we're generally talking about this sort of platonic ideal of a stick and drywall constructed home that doesn't actually exist in the real world. The construction materials you need to think of that are going to be a challenge. So wood and sheetrock is not generally that much of an issue for us. But things like stone and masonry, poured concrete, radiant heat is one that I get a lot. That's just water. Water is going to block RF. If you have very tall, floor to ceiling mirrors, electronic glass that you can dim, electronically, hurricane glass in certain parts of the country and parts of the globe, those are going to be an issue as well. So generally, if you have a home that's made out of wood and sheetrock, not a lot of stone, not a lot of concrete, not a lot else in there, it's not the hardest thing in the world to get some solid Wi-Fi going. But when you do get to some more challenging construction materials, that's when it does become more difficult, and we have to, get a little bit more creative from a design perspective.
And you would solve those problems with getting the access points, or essentially the antennas transmitting the Wi-Fi, either closer to the user or in a location more ideal. Like, for example, in my grandfather's house, which is only like 1,600 square feet, he was having issues, and it was because his router was placed directly on the other side of a bathroom with a full-size mirror, and then the kitchen with a refrigerator right on the other side of it. And he wanted to sit at his island. And so just getting that, it wasn't a square footage limitation, it was just poor location. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things, because we have a lot of smart people that work in this industry and they're very technical, but it's really the most fundamental is basically, where am I mounting the access point, and what direction am I orienting the dome? So in a best case scenario, an access point would be mounted like a smoke detector. So in the ceiling, dome down, and then you could sort of visualize a donut pattern of RF energy that's going to radiate from there. Now, our access points have something a little bit additional to that, where we actually focus RF energy towards where the client devices are, and that gives us a cleaner signal-to-noise ratio, better connection rates. But in general, there's there's reasons why you might put an access point on a wall or above some cabinetry, but in general, you want to mount them above the ceiling, dome down like a smoke detector. And then, as I was talking about, that we have different rules of thumb depending on what the construction materials are and the technology you're using. But you figure without getting into details, between 12 and 1,500 square feet per access point is really going to give you the best coverage, because then we have a nice overlap in signal coverage. And that's what's really helpful as I walk around a large home and my phone, for instance, goes from access point to access point. You have to be careful with the number of access points that you use, the number of antennas that are being placed in the home, because with an enterprise solution, it's very intelligent and it's going to dynamically react to the environment. So where that's really helpful is in a place like Midtown Manhattan, where I have a lot of neighbors that are putting out a lot of RF energy, and my network is going to sort of dynamically work around that, so we're not stepping on each other. But the same is true, in a large home, where if I put in too many access points, they're going to see all of this additional RF energy and they're going to turn themselves down so they don't step on each other. So it is sort of a Goldilocks zone where you don't want to overdo it. You don't want too many access points, but you also don't want too few. But then we also have areas like in the Caribbean or places like Florida, where a lot of these homes are sort of concrete bunkers, and RF does not go through concrete. Or at least the RF where we're playing in the Wi-Fi space. So we have some problem-solving tools that we have for those that basically would put one in every room, and then they're purposely built to not broadcast RF energy outside of that room.
Now, I want to jump back, because we've been talking a lot about wireless, and there's a sense, if you watch adverts on television, you can, as Keith said it earlier, you can one thingy in your house from your favorite internet provider does everything. But there are two things, aren't there? There's both the need for a mix of a wired and a wireless network. And then, those things I get from Verizon or Comcast shove everything in a single box and we break it out. So there's two different questions. One, why is it important to break out? Why do you need both wireless and Wi-Fi? And why should I break out those things into separate boxes?
Yeah, really good question. So first of all, the reason why you would break it out into separate boxes is because, one box that does all things is not going to do it as well as different discrete components. That's their only job, to focus on, instead of having, a device that's a router and wireless and your wired network switching, to have a security device that's only job is to sit between, your house and the internet to make sure that you're safe. And then, another box whose job is really just to route all of the wired traffic, and then, additional boxes that their job is to transmit RF. And then rather transmitting RF from where your equipment is located, oftentimes in the homes where we work, those are in, mechanical closets that are air conditioned, that are far off from the main living space, and actually move those antennas to where people are going to use the network. So that's one part of it. The other thing is I talk a lot about wireless because that's the part where the end users typically interact with the network, or at least knowingly interact with the network. And typically, if people have pain points, they perceive them as being wireless pain points. So that's something that we talk about a lot. But the wired infrastructure is as important, if not more important, because the wireless access points also live on the wired infrastructure, right? So that they're only going to be as good as the wired infrastructure works. And so I'm in the business of wireless networking, and I will tell you, wired is better than wireless every time. Wire everything that you can possibly wire. So if you have smart TVs, if you have, Sonos type speakers, anything that can be wireless or wired, pull a wire there. That's going to do a couple things. It's going to make sure that you're going to have more robust performance on those wired devices, but it's also going to take the load off of the network for the other devices, like your iPhone, for instance, that must be wireless. A lot of people think that Wi-Fi can have lots of conversations at the same time, right? So maybe me and my wife are both watching YouTube on our phone and we're both connected to the same access point. You would think that it's having a conversation with me and a conversation with her at the same time. But what it's really doing is it's sending a packet of information to my phone and a packet of information to her phone. And it's just doing it so quickly that it seems like it's happening all at the same time. The more client devices that you have in any given space, and think about, all of the, integrated devices in the home, from the lights and thermostats and audio video, et cetera, that's really going to put a tremendous strain on the network. And you may not even perceive it today, but maybe you end up having a party or, a wedding or something in your backyard, and everything was working swimmingly up until that point. And now I can't play Spotify by the pool area. And that's just a function of, there's so many client devices that are within physical range of that access point that now the device that needs to connect to that access point can't. So it's really important to have a robust wired infrastructure. Another neat thing that we can do is we can segregate traffic based on different disciplines or different uses for the wired traffic. We could do it for wireless as well, but it all lives on the wired side of the network. So what that means is that maybe you have, a lot of security cameras that are hogging up a lot of bandwidth. Well, we don't want to impact, the homeowner who's also going to be trading from one of their terminals, right? We want to keep that traffic completely separate, and we can, set priorities of one over the other, what we would call a quality of service. Even maybe we route the kids' traffic over a different internet connection than we route the grown-ups traffic, because the grown-ups traffic is what actually, comes to pay for all of this stuff, right? So from a security perspective, and then of course, if you're having guests stay with you, even if it's, your brother is coming to stay with you, you always put them on a guest network. And the reason for that is they may be well-intentioned. You may trust them a great deal, but for all you know, their Android phone or their Mac laptop or whatever it is infected with some sort of malware, and they don't know it. So by putting them on their own isolated guest network, it's all living on the same hardware infrastructure, but software-wise, it's segregated out. Then you know that you're never going to have a situation where they infect your devices.
Yeah, we definitely need to cover that security conversation shortly. But I want to ask you, when you talked about the conversations and the packets, this is something, again, that we ran into with a lot of our clients, which is everything worked really well on day one. And then later they, got a PlayStation for their kid, and they put it in a room that was in the corner of the house, furthest away from the router or the access points. And now all of a sudden, all of their speeds have slowed down and they don't really understand why. And my understanding is it's essentially, if it's having trouble communicating with that one device, it's going to resend packets until it gets essentially confirmation that they went through, and then it's going to move on with the rest of the devices. And so people were actually essentially creating situations where, yes, it works great on day one, but because they didn't have full coverage of the home, they eventually created some use case scenario where all of a sudden it doesn't work. And with a good design, we can essentially cover future use cases, not just the day they move in. Is that pretty accurate?
Yeah, it's pretty accurate in general. What I would say is that we have some proprietary technologies that we use that sort of can solve a lot of that. So, for instance, one of the things you talked about that I'm picking up is something that we would describe as airtime fairness. So, the way typically Wi-Fi works is the first device, or in some cases, the first few devices that connect to an access point, are going, for whatever reason, the network is going to assume that they are priorities, and so that they're going to get their traffic will be prioritized. So we have something called airtime fairness that basically, it doesn't matter the sequence of operations of when a client device connects to the network. We're going to make sure that they're all treated equally, unless there's some configuration to say that this traffic needs to be prioritized over other traffic. So that's one part of it. Another thing is that we also have something called channel fly and background scanning. And what that means is that, so you mentioned on day one, performance was great, and then it sort of diminished from there. With our wireless, typically it goes in the other direction. So your wireless performance should actually improve. You may perceive it, you may not. It depends on where you are. Certain really dense urban environments, you'll see it more than rural areas or large estates where there's less interference. But the way that works is that our networks are constantly sampling the RF that's in the environment. And so it sort of creates a composite sketch of all of the RF that's being used, and then dynamically make sure that the home network is not using those channels. And so it does take a few days for it to aggregate that picture, and then that's why we see performance improve over time. It's also one of the reasons why, sort of counterintuitively, we're big believers in not rebooting your network gear. Because some of your network gear may live in the cloud, and so it's less of an issue. But if it's local on the network, and you reboot the network, you may lose some of that historical information, which means that your performance is back to where it was on day one. It doesn't see that improvement. So
And that's just a
definitely don't want
practice.
to be rebooting networks. I'm sorry?
That sounds like just a practice that we've developed because of using do-it-yourself or cheaper gear, where it kind of was the solution compared to enterprise-grade gear.
Yeah, general rule, consumer grade gear, stuff that we don't have a lot of control over, things like cable boxes, Apple TVs, even the modem that's provided by the internet provider. Yeah, absolutely. You have no choice. We're going to have to reboot that. And integrators are very clever about automating that and giving you touch panel buttons and that sort of thing. But the actual network infrastructure, the enterprise grade gear, you do not want to reboot it. As a matter of fact, we do recommend having them on battery backups. So, for instance, in my house, we have this gas generator. What the battery backup does is it just makes sure that my network doesn't go offline for that one moment in between when my power goes out and when my generator kicks in.
Okay, I want to go back to the security conversation because we started down that, and then we wanted to close off the other thing. If the number one question we get is around why do I need enterprise class hardware, the number two question I think we get is I don't trust any of this internet security stuff. What can we do about that? What is your sort of 101, start from the bottom? How do I make sure this thing is secure and safe?
Yeah, so there's a few aspects of that. Number one, nobody likes to hear it, but the biggest weak link, the biggest attack vector is always going to be human beings. And so that could be, just not following best practices, or social engineering, or phishing, or spear phishing, which we can talk about if you care to. But it's usually the human being that's involved in the network. They're the biggest point of failure. So actually training them against some of these exploits is the best thing you can do. And there are some services out there. We use one here internally that constantly peppers me with fake messages to try to train me to not click on the things that I'm not supposed to click on. And they can get very good. So that we don't want to neglect the human component, because that is generally the biggest concern. But then beyond that, there's a few other avenues that we could do to secure the network. To me, the most important part is the firewall. So in a typical consumer grade network, you may have one box that's doing everything. We talked about that before, right? So oftentimes people just shorthand call it your router, and it sort of grates on me a little bit when people talk about their router with respect to Wi-Fi, because routing has nothing to do with Wi-Fi, but oftentimes they're in one box. And so that's going to be your security appliance, your router, your modem, your switch, your wireless all in one box if you're getting it from the internet provider. What we typically do is we break those out into different components, and one of those is the firewall. So some people call the firewall a router. In some cases, it is doing routing, but really, if you're doing an enterprise layer 3 network, the routing is actually going to be happening at the switches. Whereas what we would call the router, the firewall, what that really is just a security device. And so it's sort of a gateway between your home network, what we call the LAN, and the internet, what we call the WAN. It sort of just sets sentry between the LAN and the WAN to keep you secure. And selecting a firewall for for a home is very difficult to do because a lot of these firewalls are not built to go into a home. And so, I've been involved in, over my career, many projects, 50,000 square feet and larger, and you walk the project and the project manager, general contractor, whoever it is, they'll be like, well, this is not a residence, right? This is a commercial deployment. It's as big as, any, Amazon warehouse or whatever it is. And that's really true for things like your mechanicals, your air conditioner, things like that. But when it comes to the network, people still live there, right? So the dynamic is different. So, there's a lot of manufacturers out there that make really good firewalls that work well, if this was a data center or a bank, but they don't work really well if this was, if this was a luxury home. So what we do is we curate, the solutions, and then we sort of layer our special sauce onto that, which do both very well. We sort of smooth out those rough edges. So for instance, a lot of residential internet connections do not have a static IP address. They're going to be dynamic. They're going to change. Most businesses are going to have a static IP address. So a lot of very nice firewalls are not built to have a dynamic IP address. Whereas that's something that we can be able to provide, because where you build your home may not even have that as an option, even if you're willing to pay for it as a service. So robust firewall is probably the most important part from a network selection, and then making sure that your services are active on that firewall. So, the firewalls we use are from a company called Sophos primarily. They make really good firewalls, and without the services included, they work great, and they're a terrific security appliance.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt. I just want to dig into one of the things you were just saying, which is, I have an antivirus thing that runs on my laptop, and every once a month, or more often, I don't really know, it upgrades with the latest set of things to watch out for. Yet I live in a house with a integrated wireless router thing provided by Google. I don't know if that's ever updating. I mean, I don't. Is what you're saying that you can give that sort of upgrade capability to a home?
Yeah, exactly. So usually there's two ways that's done. One is sort of stateful inspection, just the features that are part of the firmware, either that the firewall ships with or that you update, and that's going to patch known security issues. Used to be headline news, and now they get pushed to the bottom because they happen so much. So we sort of tune them out. So the firmware that's in that device is usually going to do a good job of getting at those exploits when they come out. A more robust firewall solution, you can actually have a subscription service. So for instance, the ones that we use, they get about 400,000 new threat definitions every day pushed to them. And so since these same firewalls are used in high profile commercial environments, think like Microsoft data centers or banking institutions, companies, things like that. If somebody tries to hack into one of those sites and they have the same firewall that you have in your home, we'll sort of capture we won't, the robots will sort of capture that exploit, reverse engineer it, and then within a day or so, then make sure that those homes are inoculated against those exploits.
Sounds really incredible. So just to kind of give somebody a better idea of what we're talking about, what are those threats? Like, what do those threats look like? Because most of our clients are individuals, but they're typically high net worth individuals. What do they have to risk if they are, caught up in one of these exploits?
Well, high net worth individuals have the most to risk because of their high net worth, right? That's what's at risk there. It's something like, if you compare some of these individuals to small businesses, it's something like more than half of small businesses have been victim of some sort of malicious attack, and those can take a few different forms. Some of them are very sophisticated. Some of them take advantage of some fundamental features of the technology that is in the reference chipsets that all manufacturers use. Those are rare. You usually see one of those maybe once, maybe twice a year, and those get patched and everybody goes along their way. Oftentimes, there's no real world actual harm that's done because some really smart people, white hat hackers, are usually the ones that find it, and then they bring that up to the consortium and they get addressed by the various manufacturers. The ones that I see that are more common that actually have a real world impact are phishing campaigns primarily. And so what phishing is you may get an email that looks like it's from your boss, or it looks like it's from somebody else asking you to do a call to action, whether that's to click on a link, whether that's to send funds to a certain place, whatever that is. And in some cases, there's even some social engineering component where somebody picks up the phone, or you could even in a business location where somebody holds open a door for you and you come in, or even dropping a USB. A thumb drive in a parking lot and somebody plugs it in, and then they have their entire network compromised by plugging that in. So those are some of the different exploits that we see, some of the different malicious attacks. What we can do from a technology perspective is sort of identify these. So through artificial intelligence, we can sort of put a thumbprint on what looks like the type of thing that's safe and what's the type of thing that's not safe. So for instance, if I go to download a file, rather than whitelisting all of the files that are safe to download, because you couldn't possibly do that, what we do is we use artificial intelligence and machine learning that'll say, okay, I've never seen something like this that looks safe. What I'm going to do is I'm going to download this in the internet, and then we'll detonate it in the cloud. And then if everything looks safe over there, then we will allow the end user to download it locally. So that's one thing that you could do. But as I say, the biggest point of failure is generally going to be the user, the person. So that's why it's really important to, if you see an email, you're not sure, mouse over the links, look at the URL that it's trying to send you to, pick up the phone, don't call the number that's in the email, call the number that you have elsewhere, verify anything that you have the slightest suspicion of before you engage.
So you're saying my ISP router is not checking files for me in the cloud before it lets me download it?
No, I mean, I'm sure there's some, rudimentary security features on some of these. I wouldn't know. I haven't had one for many years. But no, they're not going to be sandboxing your downloads.
Okay, so let's try and bring this conversation together. Someone's got an incredibly exciting new home project going on, and they may be talking to Bravas if we're lucky. If not, they're talking to somebody else. Hopefully, they still come to Access Networks. What are the top 2 or 3 questions you think a homeowner should ask the person doing their networking to make sure they've got the right plans in place?
It's interesting the way you phrase that, because usually I think of it from the reverse, right? Which is, what are the questions that their integrator should be asking the end user? We certainly have some suggested questions on what those are. If we're going to turn it around the other way, and how would an end user interview prospective integrator to deploy a network for them? I would ask them, what type of solutions do they use? What brands are they associated with, and why do they use them? And do they use them everywhere? A lot of integrators use certain solutions in certain types of deployments, and then use different solutions in different deployments. One of the things that I think gets really lost is that because we are infrastructure, you may not think of us as infrastructure, but because we are infrastructure, the network should scale with the rest of the project. So, a lot of people think that, we charge XYZ for networks. Well, that doesn't really mean a whole lot. The network should be thought of in the same way that you would think of the cabling for the home, or the labor that's going to be provided to do all the integration, or the racks where all of the equipment is going to live. If you increase any one area of this project, right, whether it's shades or security or audio video control, whatever it is, the network infrastructure is going to need to scale with that as well. So it's important that end users come into that knowing that we're going to be proportional with the rest of the network. And if they decide that, hey, they really love music and they really want speakers everywhere, I think that's awesome. So do I. But just note that the network infrastructure is going to need to scale up to support that as well.
Yeah, I mean, when we talk about foundation, you mentioned foundations earlier. We talk about the 3 essential parts of the foundation are networking, power and security. And while you might not think of those as the sexiest things in the house, if the power doesn't work, your house doesn't work. If the network doesn't work, your house doesn't work, and if your house isn't secure, then all sorts of things happen. And so every high quality home is built on those foundational elements, I think we would say. Look, this is a great conversation. My guess is we could talk forever about this, and we may well come back to you. We'll see the questions we go. But before we let you go, we always play our 3-question game with our favorite contestants, and you're today's favorite contestant. And so let's do the 3-question game. When you think about your home and home technology, what do you think is the best piece of home technology you couldn't live without?
So I have a lot of technology in my home, and my home is sort of the more 2,000 square foot scale. So I don't require some of that more robust infrastructure. One of my favorite pieces of technology we have here is Google Assistant. Some people like Alexa, some people like Josh, some people like other solutions, but I really have been very happy with Google Assistant. We had an interesting interaction a couple days ago where my 5-year-old daughter ran up to me and said, "Hey, Daddy." No, wait. "Hey, Google." And I was, was a little down that she thought that Google knew more than me, but
and as if by magic, she appears.
Yes. So Google and the NSA are both listening in on this conversation.
Okay, well let's give them something to listen to. When you think about a project you've worked on in the last few years, is there a really exciting project that jumps to mind?
Yeah, we've been involved in a lot of really cool projects. Obviously, a lot of brand name end users and all that stuff is really cool. If pressed, I would probably say we had a project a few months ago that wasn't going well for a couple external reasons, not anyone's fault. And what we did is we ended up parachuting in, a bunch of engineers at no charge, and we were able to get everything reoriented and get the end user back into a state where everything was functioning and they didn't have to think about their network, and to a state where the the integrator was able to then go focus on other things. And so that's the kind of stuff that I really like. I'm a little jaded at this point with the big fancy houses, but what's really cool to me is trying to find a problem and then how can we come to a resolution there and make sure that everybody's happy.
Okay, and last but not least, is there a technology that hasn't been invented that you think would make your life easier?
Where could we begin? Food replicators would be pretty cool. No, honestly, so not far from where I live, Nikola Tesla started working on, late in his life, started working on wireless power transmission. Depending on who you talk to, he either achieved that and died and the secret is lost, or it's not something that's actually feasible. But to me, I think that that's something that would be really cool. I think that would solve a lot of the design challenges we have in the integrated homes, and it would just be pretty neat. I absolutely hate seeing wires. So anytime we can remove wires, that makes me very happy.
We agree with you. We think wires, we would spend a lot of effort to declutter the wires and make everybody's lives better. And I know networking and the right networking is really at the corner of that. So we're really grateful for the time you spent with us. I'm sure we'll come back for more, but for the moment, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Yeah, thanks for your time, Ben.